Okay, let's get going. Thank you all for joining. I am Kimball Parker. I'm the CEO of SixFifty, and for those of you that are hearing about SixFifty for the first time, we're the technology arm of the law firm Wilson Sonsini. And so, in the technology space, Wilson Sonsini is like the New York Yankees of law firms. They helped found Apple and brought them public. Same with Google. Twitter, Lyft, Tesla, SpaceX, and a whole bunch of other technology companies. We work with Wilson Sonsini to create automated legal products like TurboTax, but with the best lawyers in the world behind it. And the idea is to automate the law so that it lowers the price, and so that you don't have to be Apple to afford their legal help. And so we have a really fun job. We build products for businesses that need legal help. And we also build products for people who need legal help. And we developed an automated tool for people at risk of eviction during the pandemic called Hello Landlord that's helped over 14,000 people all for free to stay in their homes. So, but today we're going to be talking about what impact COVID has had on employment law, and both what parts of that of those changes will be permanent, and what part of those changes will be temporary. And so we have some interesting expertise in this area, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about that. Wilson Sonsini has some of the best employment experts in the nation, and a lot of our clients and the firm's clients have been struggling to figure out basically how to manage all these layers of COVID regulation. And so we worked with Wilson Sonsini to build some automated tools to help companies manage this crisis. The first was a tool that we called Return to Work, that has policies and assessments that a company needs to keep up with the layers of law that are constantly changing. And we also developed an automated employee handbook that has over 50 employment policies that account for COVID and a workforce that's more remote and mobile, and that account for the law in every state in the nation. And we update these products, both Return to Work and Employee Handbook, either weekly or monthly, depending on how the changes go. So that the policies never go out of date. So anyway, but I'm telling you this because you're going to hear from two of the main people who helped build those products. So the first is Ryan Parker. He graduated near the top of his class from the University of Michigan, which is one of the best law schools in the nation. He clerked for two federal court judges, including one on the Third Circuit, a very prestigious thing to do. He then spent a decade working for the Justice Department, litigating some of the most high-profile cases handled by the government. And a big part of his practice was employment law. And so we were lucky to be able to pull him away from the government and to help us build really great legal products here with us at a SixFifty. Second, you're going to hear from Marie Colbeth. She, just like Ryan, graduated from one of the top law schools in the nation at the top of her class. She clerked for a federal circuit court judge in the Fifth Circuit in the South. She worked in private practice and then was a professor at BYU Law School. And Marie was actually our very first hire. And so one of the best decisions we ever made. It's not an exaggeration to say that Ryan and Marie are two of the top experts in the nation about how COVID has impacted the legal framework of the workplace. And so be prepared to be impressed. You're also going to hear from two of our new hires of ours. One is William Bates. We pulled him away from being the general counsel at Encircle, which is a nonprofit that helps LGBTQ individuals. And the second is Connor Christensen, who was actually one of my students at BYU Law School, who we've hired on. And so they're great as well, and you'll enjoy them. Two plugs, and then we'll be off to the races. If you're interested in learning more about our Return to Work product or our Employee Handbook product, you can go to the following URLs, which we'll put in the chat. So for the handbook, you can go to 650.com/handbook. And for Return to Work, you can go to 650.com/return to work. And so if you want to learn more, see a demo, et cetera, you can go there. That's the last I'm going to mention of it. Second, today's today's webinar is CLE eligible for you attorneys out there. And so we will post the code in the middle of the webinar. You can write that code down, and we'll email you the form and the instructions to get credit. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Ryan, Marie, William, and Connor to talk about COVID and what effects of that will stick and what effects will hopefully go away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kimball. We're really looking forward to this webinar. As Kimball mentioned, we are helping over 200 businesses with the return to work. And we frequently talk to our customers about issues that they're confronting. And there are essentially three topics that have come up frequently over the last couple of weeks: vaccines, masks, and health screening. And we're going to talk about those three subjects today for a little while, because those are the ones that seem to be on everyone's mind. And then we're going to talk a little about some of the lessons learned. It's been interesting for us as we've worked with companies and we've seen them responding to the pandemic and preparing to move to a post-pandemic world, we all hope. And we are going to talk for a little while about some of the things that they've done to prepare themselves for that. I want to start out just sort of by setting the scene. It wasn't all that long ago, in March 2020, that many of us at SixFifty were preparing to follow our favorite team, the Utah Jazz, when Utah Jazz center Rudy Gobert came down with COVID and the NBA was shut down. Within a matter of hours, we had emailed our staff and told them not to come into work, and we had moved to a remote workplace. And a few months later, we launched our return to work tool set. And a lot of our customers were thinking that they would be going back to work in the late summer or fall of 2020. And here we are now in May 2021. And many of those customers still are not fully back to work or have just started to go back to work. And so this pandemic has taken a lot of twists and turns for businesses. But we have, especially in the last 2 weeks, with guidance that's been issued by the CDC, I think turned a corner. And so we're going to talk about maybe that corner and how it affects vaccines, policies, the collection of vaccination information. We're going to talk about mask rules, specifically places that have local rules, places without local rules, what you can and can't do. We're going to talk about health screening. And then we're going to jump into a couple of best practices and especially focus on laying a strong policy foundation. As always, we'd love to leave some time at the end for Q&A. We hope that this will be a dynamic discussion, and we'd encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A so that we can answer them. We'll try to answer some of them if they're sort of on the topic we're discussing as we go. We'll save other questions for the end at the Q&A. And just to reiterate, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar so that you can refer to it at a later date if you want. So I've kind of covered the agenda. I want to jump right into vaccinations and vaccine policy specifically. In December of 2020, right as the vaccines were getting ready to come out, the EEOC issued some clarification and answered a question that was on the minds of a lot of employers. Can I require my employees to be vaccinated? And the EEOC's response was that in many cases, and I would even say that in most cases, employers can require their employees to be vaccinated in order for them to enter the work site. But if they do require vaccinations, they need to have a policy in place that allows employees who cannot be vaccinated, either because of a medical condition or disability, or a sincerely held religious belief, to seek an exemption from that policy. Interestingly, some businesses also were watching OSHA to see if OSHA might require businesses to take some steps with regard to vaccinations, either by requiring businesses to mandate vaccinations or at least encourage them. And OSHA, federal OSHA and the state OSHAs have so far sort of stepped back and they haven't done that. And so based on the EEOC's guidance and OSHA's lack of involvement, employers are left with essentially three options when it comes to vaccination policies. One, they can require vaccinations. Two, they can encourage but not require vaccinations. And three, they can decide not to do anything policy-wise with regard to vaccinations. And I think this is kind of an interesting choice for businesses because it's not necessarily straightforward. There are some pros and cons to each of the decisions. So we wanted to take just a minute and put up a poll. We'd love to gather data. We have it looks like over 80 companies on this webinar. We'd love to get some of the data from you about what you're doing. So can we pull up our first poll on vaccinations and which of the different paths you are taking on your business? So the question is, how is your company approaching vaccinations? You can choose, we've adopted a policy requiring vaccinations. That would be a mandatory policy. We've adopted a policy encouraging vaccinations. That's what we call a voluntary or encouraging policy. We've decided not to adopt a policy, or we haven't decided. And while you're doing that, I could go through just a couple of the pros and cons, and I'm interested to see kind of what our panelists or what our attendees today have chosen. But a mandatory policy does guarantee a lot of protection for employees, customers, and others who enter your workplace. The downside is that you have to make sure that you provide for exemptions, and there certainly is some resources that are required to run a mandatory policy. A voluntary policy where you encourage vaccinations can provide a lower level of protection, but also less work because you may not need to run a program for taking exemptions. And I would say, in my view, the worst option for most businesses is not to do anything, because I think that employees are maybe more than at any time in the past looking to their employers for information about vaccines and about COVID-19, but also to know that they're being protected in the workplace. So we'll give you just another second or two to vote, and then we'll pull up our results of this poll. I have a strong suspicion of what our results might be. Interesting. So we have 10% that are requiring vaccinations. That's consistent with what we've often seen. We have 40% who have adopted policies encouraging vaccinations. We have 8%, a little under 10, who have decided not to adopt a vaccination policy. And for some businesses, that may be the right choice. And finally, we have about 42% that are still trying to decide what to do about their vaccination policies. And I think that's about right. For businesses that haven't brought their employees back, that may be an issue that they haven't had to confront yet. So we have done this poll in one other webinar, and we have asked a lot of the businesses that we're helping, and I think these poll results are pretty much consistent. I would say that the majority of companies that we've talked to are choosing the middle option by encouraging vaccinations. And some of them are providing incentives. That could be a gift card. Initially, early on, some companies were providing time off, but there's a lot of state laws now that require companies to give states time off for vaccinations. And so you're seeing some companies that are encouraging without an incentive, and others that are providing small incentives to help encourage their employees to be vaccinated. So with that, I want to move on to the latest guidance from the CDC that has really kind of changed the landscape for vaccinations, and has, I think, brought this issue to the fore for a lot of companies that wanted to kind of step back and wait to decide on a vaccination policy. So when we're looking at the CDC's guidance that came out May 16th for people who are fully vaccinated, the thing that really jumped out to most people was that the CDC essentially said that fully vaccinated individuals may resume activities without wearing a mask or staying 6 feet apart. And I read some interesting articles about these guidelines from the CDC, and I think that some commentators feel that the CDC actually is trying to incentivize people to get vaccinated by telling them that if they do, they could do away with wearing masks and social distancing. And I think that that's actually having the desired effect if that drove the CDC in some part. But the CDC's guidance doesn't stop with that clarification about mask wearing and social distancing. It points out that those guidelines don't apply where masks and social distancing are required by local laws and workplace guidance. And so you have many states, including New York and California, with the emergency temporary standards that have been issued by Cal OSHA, that still require masks and social distancing in the workplace. I expect these states to make some changes. California has already announced that they're going to lift their mask mandate on June 15th. And I think that Cal OSHA is likely to be amended before that time. But it's important for people to realize that the CDC guidance is just sort of one level of guidelines. You have the CDC guidance, and then and OSHA and EEOC on the federal level, but then you also have state and local guidance. And in many cases, the state and local guidance has not yet caught up with the CDC. The other thing that was interesting, and this was actually came in the CDC guidelines that came before the May 16th update, was that individuals who are fully vaccinated don't need to quarantine after close contact with COVID-19 cases. And that's a big deal for a lot of businesses. I think that that was probably the basis, the most popular bases upon which employees had to quarantine. You know, if you're asking, have you tested positive? Do you have symptoms? Have you been in close contact? I think employees were most likely to have to click close contact and then to have to quarantine initially for 14 days. And then later that was lowered to 10 days. The other thing I wanted to touch on with regard to the CDC guidance that I found interesting was the CDC explicitly acknowledged that we are still learning how long the vaccines protect people. So as a business, if you're starting to think long-term about collecting vaccination information or other things, you may be thinking, well, when do people need to get a booster? Is this going to be like a flu shot where they get it every year? And I think we're still learning about that. And then how effective these vaccines are against variants. That's an issue that we're still watching very closely. And it'll be interesting, you know, we see new variants of the flu every season. I'm not sure if that's going to be the same with COVID-19, if we're likely to see new variants every year, or if it's going to be a longer period of time. But I think we've already seen variants, and that variants are likely to play a role in how COVID-19 policy evolves in the future. You know, the interesting thing about this vaccination announcement from the CDC is that it has affected pretty much all of the other aspects of returning to work, including masks. You know, masks have been a big issue throughout the pandemic, and this guidance on fully vaccinated individuals has really changed the playing field on masks, both outside the workplace and inside the workplace.
And I'll say, I think one of the things to keep in mind, just as we start talking a little bit more in depth about masks, Ryan, is that, we have the CDC guidance. The variant issue right now, we're seeing so far that the current variants, the vaccine is considered effective, but that is something that could change. So in terms of like how quickly things are changing, like these things that we're about to talk about could change really quickly again. But in terms of masking in the workplace, the most common question is, so now that we're getting into the vaccine stage, can I still require my unvaccinated employees to wear masks in the workplace? And that brings up a whole lot of new issues in the sense that if you're going to have a policy for different employees, unvaccinated versus vaccinated, you're going to have to know the status of your employees with the vaccine. So that's where we start to see a lot of the differentiations coming in between state, local, and federal guidance. So, we have sort of the main CDC differentials here on the slide, but one that I did want to point out is that there are still some places where everyone is expected to wear a mask under the CDC guidance. And that includes, correctional facilities, homeless shelters, public transportation, and transportation hubs. So we're most familiar with that in the airports right now, but it also applies to buses, bus depots, trains, train depots. So subways, the metro, like you need to be paying attention to those rules as well. If for any reason your employees are in those locations for purposes of, fulfilling their job duties or something along those lines, if you operate one of those types of sites. So there are still places where masking is mandatory for everyone. And the CDC has given us this great infographic that we decided to go ahead and put into the slideshow for you today, just so that you would have it. We're not going to go through each and every example of places where people do and don't need masks under the new CDC guidance, but it is, again, just really helpful. So we're just going to go through these two slides and hit the next one after that. Thank you. So one thing I also did want to point out, though, is because there are still places where masks are required, or if you're unvaccinated, where under the CDC guidance you still do need a mask, I wanted to point out something about exemptions to the masking rules that you should be taking into account as you're looking at your workplace policies. And that is that you're exempt from the mask requirements where they still apply, only if you fit into certain categories under the CDC guidance. And these, I think, have caused a lot of confusion throughout the entire last year, partially because states often have their own version of these rules. But if you are following the CDC guidance, if somebody has a physical, intellectual, developmental, cognitive, or psychiatric disability that would prevent them from removing their mask in the event the mask has, in the event that there's a hazard, so for example, they're choking, they need to remove the mask, those people are exempt even where masks are still required. Similarly, if somebody needs an assistive device, so perhaps they're wearing an oxygen mask, perhaps they have some other sort of physical assistive device that they can't wear at the same or use at the same time that they're wearing a mask, then they're exempt from the mask requirements. Although that exemption, if they only need that device intermittently, they don't need it consistently, they would only be exempt when they're not using or wearing the device. And then one that I think has come up quite a bit is sensory disabilities and respiratory issues. So perhaps you have asthma or you have a sensory disability that makes it very uncomfortable to wear the mask. The CDC guidance is actually pretty strict on that. And I think this is the one that causes the most confusion, which is just that for those individuals, they are technically still required to be masked under the CDC guidance. Unless like if you're in respiratory distress at the time. So like you have asthma, as a general rule, you're not exempted, but if you're experiencing some kind of distress, you are exempted. If you have a sensory disability, you're not generally exempted. But if that disability, for example, causes the person to become a threat to themselves or others, if they're forced to mask, then they would be exempted. So I just wanted to sort of point those out really quickly because they are sort of unusual nuances of the guidance that most people aren't as familiar with. So keep those in mind as you're implementing and looking at new policies. And then what we want to spend most of the time on, though, is talking about the differences across states right now, because that's where we're seeing the majority of the differences. So as we talk about sort of the state-by-state approach, we've seen that in different states, they're adopting the CDC guidance, sometimes wholesale and sometimes not. So if we could just advance the slide. Thank you. Oh, actually, sorry, I skipped a slide. I was going to skip this. I just want to say, if any of you are going on vacation, federal property, you still need masks if you're unvaccinated, if you're indoors on any national park, for example, and if you're outdoors and unvaccinated, you also still need a mask if it's not possible to socially distance. So, for example, if you're crossing that Golden Gate Bridge during a really high, busy tourist time, and you're shuffling along with everyone else, you need your mask on. So just keep those in mind, as well as public transportation. So if you're taking a shuttle from the parking lot to a trailhead in a national park, you need to have your mask on no matter what your vaccination status is currently. So those are just a couple of things. And then now we'll get to the states. Sorry, I anticipated myself. So some states have started, like I said, wholesale adopting the CDC guidance. But even then, you still see differences. Ryan sort of teed this up when he was talking about the differences that you see in states and localities. So I wanted to give a couple of examples where you could see that. And if you're using our return to work tool, you have a very robust guidance that on all of these. These are just some of the states. We're getting more states every week. But Delaware is a good example where they've adopted the CDC guidelines, but then they've also given this guidance that says that employers are responsible to ensure that all employees, visitors, and patrons are complying with CDC guidance. But they haven't given any additional rules. So they haven't said, so you need to do A, B, and C, but they've said it is your responsibility. So companies need to think about, well, I'm operating in Delaware. How do I fulfill that responsibility? How do I determine who's vaccinated and who's not so that we can follow CDC guidance? And that's really where we're starting to see the differences, with some states giving that guidance and others not. Washington, D.C. is another example where they're following the guidance, but not quite. They've adopted it, but they're going to have what they call a full reopening on June 11th. So until then, bars, nightclubs, sports venues, entertainment venues still have mask rules in place no matter the vaccination status. So there's, like I said, some places where you generally have the CDC guidance, but there may be some exceptions or some additional things you need to think about. And
Marie,
Ryan,
can I jump in there just for a minute? We have an interesting question that I think dovetails well with what you just said about Delaware. The question is it legal to require visitors and vendors to respond to a question whether they are vaccinated as part of our pre-entry health screening questionnaire? This is one that we see pretty often about whether, it's pretty clear you can ask your employees whether they're vaccinated, but I think there's some hesitation to ask others who come into the workplace. What do you think about that question, Marie?
I'm going to give you a very nuanced answer and say it depends. In fact, if we go to the next slide, I was going to talk about this a little bit. So generally speaking, the answer is most likely yes, you can ask. There may, though, be some state and local rules that apply that would mean you can't ask. So from like the federal OSHA perspective, you can ask if you've determined that you need to do that to establish a safe workplace. But from the state perspective, in some places, you may actually be required to ask. And in other places, you may choose not to ask for a few reasons. So I'll give a few examples. One that we were going to talk about is New York. New York has essentially adopted the guidance, but they've got additional rules and recommendations that they've given. And one of the things that they've done is that they've recommended that you should require masks if the vaccination status of the people at your workplace is unknown. And so that could be both your employees and your patrons, or your vendors, if you have vendors coming in. So, you could adopt a policy where you say, we don't want to know, we're just going to make everybody keep their masks on. That's one option. But they've also said you could require anyone to give you proof. So in New York, they've made it very clear that you could require patrons to give proof of vaccination status. And they've even suggested ways that you could do that. One of which is by having them show the Excelsior Pass. So if you're in New York, you're familiar with the state version where you could see both whether somebody's most recent COVID test was positive or negative, but also now that we've got vaccinations, you can see if they've been vaccinated. So they're saying specifically you could ask for that if you choose to. And they've sort of put out the idea that you could divide your space. So, you could have different rules applicable to different parts of your space, depending on whether or not you're collecting vaccination status. So, that's a way that you can be sure that you're complying with the guidelines. If I don't know people's vaccination status, they have to go into the area where everybody has to wear masks. If I do know, then I can regulate it and require only those who have to wear it to be masked in this area. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Maria, I was just going to jump in. I think you maybe answered this question, but we did get an interesting question that says, how does an employer manage a mixed workplace of vaccinated and unvaccinated employees without having to police different seating areas, et cetera, with social distancing? And I think that's one approach that we're seeing, is that some offices have a workspace for unvaccinated individuals where people are not having to wear masks and social distance, and another workspace for vaccinated individuals where those requirements are still in place. That's one option that at least some businesses are considering. Is that what you're seeing also, Maria? And do you have other thoughts on that?
That's certainly an option. We also have Michigan has given some guidance on this too. And one of the suggestions that they made was we suggest you collect people's vaccination status, but also we're going to say as another suggestion that you may want to continue making remote working an option. Michigan's interesting because they had required remote working for a lot of people for a long time. And now as they're moving away from that, I think they wanted to really call out that this is still an option if it's working for you. Maybe have unvaccinated employees continue working remotely as an option. Something else that you could do and again, this goes towards, how intensely do you want to have to police something like this? If you're collecting vaccination status and then, you can give employees different levels of clearance where they're told they have to wear their mask and the responsibility is then on them to do it. And if they don't wear their mask, maybe they lose the privilege of coming into the work site, something like that, where there's some sort of policy in place where they know what to expect. And you've, laid out the guidelines and you've told them to self-police. And again, whether self-policing is enough in a lot of situations is going to depend on your jurisdiction. California is a great example of that one. Just because the ETS, which you were talking about earlier, Ryan, is still in place. So emergency temporary standards still require everybody to wear masks despite the CDC guidance. And even though the state is going to lose its mask mandate on June 15th, we don't know if ETS will be updated to also change and reflect the CDC guidance, because historically so far, ETS has always been more strict than pretty much every other state in terms of both masks and reporting requirements. So in California, you have to run these daily health screeners, you have to. And so again, like how you police it is going to be jurisdiction specific, but there are options, and figuring out what option works best for your workplace is going to tie into what vaccine policy you're taking. A lot of companies have chosen an optional vaccine policy because they didn't want to collect this information. But I think that now that we're in the situation where the CDC has said there's different rules for different sets of people, that changes that calculus. You have to now say, well, in order to loosen the rules for this group of people, do we want to now start collecting some information that we were hesitant to collect earlier?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So we have two questions that I want to just touch on that I think are related to that. The first is about California. We've mentioned several times California's removing their mask mandate on June 15th. And there's a question about whether you're required to silo working spaces based on vaccination status or whether that's just a suggestion. To be honest, in answering that question, we really don't know. We're waiting for the ETS, the emergency temporary standards that were issued by Cal OSHA, to be updated. We know that the Cal OSHA is meeting on June 4th, and we expect that to be the ETS to be modified pretty significantly based on the CDC guidance and based on the guidance I think that Cal OSHA is getting from the governor's office. But we really don't know what Cal OSHA is going to look like. And we have created a Cal OSHA tool, and so we're helping a lot of businesses to create their COVID, excuse me, their COVID prevention plan or program, as they say it in the ETS. And so we're watching that, and we're expecting actually the CPPs to change pretty considerably. But at this point, we're not sure exactly what that's going to look like. And then the other question, Marie, that I think is sort of teed up by your slide is, can we continue to require all employees to wear masks in common areas regardless of vaccine status? And this maybe gets more broadly to the question, can employers require more of their employees than is required by state law? If a company thinks, our common area is kind of crowded, we want everyone to wear masks there, but they don't have to wear masks, for example, in their offices if they're vaccinated, can they do something like that?
And I would say yes in answer to that question. I think one thing that we have seen that's common across the rules that we've seen is that so far it looks like the states, at least all the ones that I've reviewed, I defer if there's one you know about that I don't, Ryan. All of the states are saying, like, these are our rules, but a business does have the right to implement stricter rules if it chooses to. And so if you want to require everyone in your office to wear a mask regardless of vaccination status, regardless of the local rule that says, our mask mandate's over, my understanding in pretty much every jurisdiction I've ever looked at is that that is acceptable. And again, the one thing to keep in mind is that there are some operational things where you have to make sure you're consistent about it, and you need the policy to be clear.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Marie. And I think we're seeing some of our customers do this, where they want to have rules that may be in some instances a little bit more strict than what they're required to do, sometimes for operational ease. And I think that's just fine. And I actually think this idea of having all employees wear masks in the common area, where you may have vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, and it may be tough to keep social distancing, makes a lot of sense, even if you're going to allow unvaccinated individuals not to wear masks or social distance once they get into the office space. I'll give one more question and then we can move on, Marie, but this is an interesting one. Given that some employees are vaccinated and others aren't, is it possible to have a policy where return to the office is 100% optional, but if you decide to return to the office, know that masks will be optional? And I've kind of given you the hard ones. I'll take a first crack at this one, Marie, and see if you want to jump in. I would say that currently, if you're in California, that is not an option because of the ETS, which require masks and social distancing. What I have seen in places outside of California is offices say, or businesses say, returning to the office is 100% optional if you are, but you're only allowed to come if you're vaccinated, because we're not going to have masks and social distancing. And I'm seeing some businesses that sort of only want to do it that way, and they need to think through that. But I think in a lot of cases that's permissible to only allow vaccinated individuals to come into the office at this point, as long as they're making sure that those who are not vaccinated, especially those that have medical conditions or sincerely held religious beliefs that would preclude them from being vaccinated, are given the the accommodations they need to make sure they're getting their work done.
And I think that's probably an important part of that conversation to have, which is, sort of on the flip side, if the thing you're thinking about doing is saying like, we're going to let unvaccinated people come into our office and not wear masks because it's optional. If we do that, are there employees who may be, discriminated against because they cannot get vaccinated? And so if they come in and nobody's wearing a mask, what kind of situation does that put that in? Is there pressure for them to come in, but they're feeling that, level of lack of safety? So just really think about like what incentives are being created, even if they're unintentional ones. Like if there's some sort of unintentional pressure being put on somebody to do something that they may feel is, unsafe for them because of their specific circumstances. Just always be really sensitive to that as you're making these decisions, in addition to obviously what you were talking about, Ryan, following the local rules. So in California, like, you can't do that right now, maybe later, but not right now. So yeah, local rules, plus think about, incentives, pressures, the workplace environment and how it may disparately impact different groups.
Yeah, definitely.
So that was, and that really is sort of, I think, the takeaway for the, thinking about what's going on at different levels. Some states and local governments have given a lot of additional guidance to help, operationally what you have to do to actually follow the CDC guidelines. Others are not following the CDC guidelines really at all. They've got their own version. I put Utah on the slide. That's an example. They dropped their mask mandate on April 10th. But again, localities have the option to have different regulations. So, Salt Lake City still had mask rules in place that they've now, adopted to match with the CDC, but we still have one county, the Grand County, which is where a couple of the national parks are located. They are still having mask rules in place if you're in any county building. So again, like vaccination status doesn't matter. The rules just, for everyone. So again, like depending on where you are, what type of organization you are, if you're a contractor for state or local government, you may need to follow more strict rules, even if the state itself has adopted the CDC guidelines. And let me just see, I think we had one more question come in that I'll hit, and then we'll give you the CLE code. Asking job applicants about their vaccination status, is that considered a disability or health related inquiry under the ADA? Ryan, would you like to speak to that, or I could speak to it?
I think this is an interesting question because I do think that it probably is a health related inquiry. You're asking them for medical information, but I think that in most situations that it would be permissible, especially if you don't ask follow-up questions. So if someone says, no, I'm not vaccinated, I think you don't want to go into, well, are you not vaccinated because you have a medical condition or disability? I think that's where you would probably run into some trouble. But I do think that you could ask people likely if they're vaccinated. And I think you need to only though do it if you think that that's an important part of the job qualifications for your job, right? If that's consistent with the way that you're trying to protect your employees. I would also be very careful about creating a record there. If you create a health record, and we're going to talk about this a little later, under the ADA, you have to keep it confidential, and you have to, which means not sharing it with anyone that doesn't have a need to know. And you can't keep it in someone's personnel file. So if you end up hiring that person, you need to make sure that information doesn't find its way into their personnel file. But I do think it probably is a, I guess it's a health related inquiry, and I would want to make sure that it doesn't become a disability related inquiry.
Yeah, I would say one thing to think about is to only do this if you have a mandatory vaccination policy. If it's not mandatory, there wouldn't really be a reason to ask that question during the application process. So keep that in mind too. Like it definitely depends on, what you've publicized, what's in your actual policy, and you'd want to inform applicants of that up front, that it would be a requirement. So that, if that becomes a decision-making factor in that applicant's file, it's very clear across the board that was always a requirement, that it wasn't added on later. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and give you guys the CLE code for those who are here for CLE credit. And with that, it'll be also posted in the chat for a minute there. And we're gonna now, Ryan, I think it would be great actually at this point if you talked a little bit about actually collecting that vaccination information. That question actually feeds really nicely into it. Can you collect it? How should you collect it?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Marie. It's interesting because early on, I think a lot of businesses were very hesitant about collecting vaccination information. And I understand why. As an attorney for years and years, I have told my clients not to collect health-related information about their employees because typically it's not relevant to the job and it just opens the door to potential legal issues regarding how the information is stored and who it's shared with. But we've entered kind of a whole new world here during the pandemic where a lot of employers are required to gather health information about their employees on a daily basis before they come into the office. And so I think some businesses were initially hesitant to gather vaccine related information. But I think that is starting to change, especially based on the CDC's new guidance, right? If businesses are looking to follow the CDC's guidance, and fully vaccinated individuals don't have to wear a mask and don't have to social distance, and unvaccinated individuals should continue to do that, they need to know the vaccination status of their employees. And so I think we're seeing more and more companies that are finding ways to collect that information, and they're doing it to help with their risk analysis as they're thinking about their return to work. I think that's very helpful. And as they set their policies, as they're thinking about kind of what policies they want to put in place for safety and for the return to work, knowing how many of your employees are vaccinated and how many members of your different teams are vaccinated. You could see a situation where if your company has a loading dock, for example, where you have a lot of people coming in and out who aren't in your company, you may want to make sure that all of those folks are vaccinated. If you have people that are computer engineers who are working from their homes, maybe it's not as important that team be fully vaccinated as far as your work considerations are considered. Again, I just wanted to hit on this though. As companies collect vaccine information, it is crucial that they understand that under the ADA, that information must be kept confidential, which means only those who have a need to know have access to that information, and it must not be stored in an employee's personnel file. It needs to be stored separately. So as we've thought about this sort of shift, one of the most interesting developments I think we've seen in the area of vaccines over the last little while is that one California county has come out with an order and is now requiring employers to collect vaccination information for their employees. And Connor Christensen is going to give us a little more information about what is going on in Santa Clara County, California.
Thanks, Ryan. We've talked a lot about the many layers of COVID regulations with federal, state, county, even city or local ordinances. Things can get out of hand pretty quickly. I'll be diving a bit deeper into one specific county here in California, Santa Clara County, where I currently live. Santa Clara County has put in place a mandate that all businesses assess the vaccination status of their personnel. This means that all employers in Santa Clara County must ask their personnel whether or not they've been vaccinated and keep a record of this information. This is the first regulation that we've seen like this. At first glance, it seems like California is up to its over-regulatory tricks again, but there's some benefits here. Much of the new COVID guidance revolves around fully vaccinated individuals. Businesses may be hesitant to ask their employees whether or not they've been vaccinated, but many health and safety considerations rely on vaccination status. This county requirement can allow businesses to blame the local government for prying into information of personnel. Regardless of your opinion on it, though, it is required. So what does that mean for us? The county has a frequently asked questions page that addresses many concerns. Employees are allowed to decline to answer whether or not they've been vaccinated, but if they do, they must be treated as if they've not been vaccinated. You may have noted that I use the word personnel repeatedly instead of employees, and that is because the requirement extends past employees and includes any volunteers, independent contractors, and even anyone who regularly works on site. The last clarifying point that I think is important is that the county only requires that you determine the vaccination status of people physically at a work site, but recommends that you do the same for remote workers. Here at the bottom of the slide, I've included links to both the frequently asked questions page and the county's sample assessment form. On the next slide, I've actually included this sample form, which I think is an interesting tool that Santa Clara County has provided. So this initial assessment must be completed by June 1st and must be updated at least every 2 weeks. This assessment can be done by verifying vaccination cards or by having employees certify their vaccination. The county's actually provided this template of what a certification of vaccination status form might look like. You can see it here on the screen. It asks fairly basic identifying information, gives clarifying information about the vaccine, and then asks employees to check whichever box describes them. This form can just be sent out to all employees, and you can verify that you've received them all back. Even if you're not in Santa Clara County, you might consider adopting part or all of this form to use in your own business. This is a pretty big regulation, especially considering what other states and localities have done. We may see more places adopt regulations like this, and we've already seen other jurisdictions recommend something like this. For businesses not in Santa Clara County, I think that this regulation can provide some clarity and guidance regarding how you should assess the vaccination status of your employees. Having a well-maintained record of who at your worksite has been vaccinated can help your business run more smoothly and help employees feel safer. Another important part of workplace safety is employee health screeners, which Ryan will be discussing.
Thanks, Connor. You know, I think you made a really interesting point there. When we first heard about the vaccines and the fact that the EEOC had said that employees could mandate vaccines, we talked to a couple of business owners who said, you know, we just wish the federal government would tell us whether we have to, whether we should mandate vaccines or not, so that we could just say, listen, it's out of our hands. The government has told us we have to do this. Because frankly, you're going to have employees maybe who are upset no matter what your decision is. And I think it's interesting here where you have businesses who may be hesitant to collect this kind of information. The county government has stepped up and said, listen, you need this kind of information to set your workplace rules and to make sure that people are following the CDC's guidance. So we're just going to require you to do it. And they've given businesses in some sense some cover to just say, okay, we know exactly what we need to do. We're just going to do what we're required to do. And if our employees are upset about it, that's the county government requirement. So I do think that's a really interesting point. Let's just move on quickly because we have a couple more things we want to hit to employee health screening. As Connor mentioned, you know, another issue that has really been affected by the CDC's guidance is employee health screening. And employee health screening requirements vary widely across states and localities. You have some states like California, Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Washington that have required employee health screening, but we're starting to see some change in those laws. And it'll be very interesting to see as we get the new ETS in California and as other states catch up with the CDC's guidance, whether they continue to require that vaccinated individuals be screened, which I think is interesting. As an aside, we've had a lot of customers reach out to us and say, so should we ask in our daily screener whether someone's vaccinated? And we typically, you know, my response is no, that you don't want to ask questions that you don't need to ask. And you don't need to ask if someone's vaccinated on a daily basis because that typically doesn't change and is often only relevant if someone has been in close contact with an individual with COVID-19. So the other thing that's interesting is I think that although we'll see changes in the law, health screening may continue to be required in some locations. I think you're going to have workplaces that have individuals who cannot receive the vaccine because of medical reasons or sincerely held religious beliefs. And frankly, vaccinated individuals can still get COVID-19, although their chances of getting it are much lower. And usually the severity of any, if they contract COVID-19, the severity of the effects is much less. I think that, you know, you still may not as a business want people who are having symptoms to come in or who have tested positive. So I do think the question we often get is whether businesses would be able to only require unvaccinated individuals to fill out a health screener. And I think that that's something that could be permissible, that in the future, as we look at how the law changes and how the guidelines evolve, that we could have a situation where you're really only having your unvaccinated individuals fill out the health screener. As we move on, you know, I guess the interesting takeaway here, as is the same with some of the other areas that we've looked at, is that the law is evolving and changing quickly. And one of the things, we're watching these laws very quickly, and we push out frequent updates to our customers on these issues, because it's hard to keep track of mask mandates, health screening mandates. If you're in Santa Clara County, vaccination employment or vaccination status requirements. And so, there's a lot going on. And I think, I guess the takeaway from here would be that businesses should look at ways that they can stay current with the latest guidance. And I guess that's one best practice. And we're going to turn to Marie to talk about another best practice.
Yeah, so I would say that, these are all really related to each other as just part of it. And one best practice that actually has come up in the chat while we were going through this section was whether, in essence, you're disclosing the vaccination status of your employees if you have a rule in place that allows some employees to be unmasked because they're vaccinated and requires other employees to be masked because they're unvaccinated. And I thought that was a really interesting question, because that was something that I had to look at for our organization when we started to decide, what rules would we adopt. And I came kind of to that conclusion. I was like, well, in essence, yes, at least insofar as some employees are not wearing their masks, they're vaccinated. There may be vaccinated employees who are wearing a mask because of, personal situations and preferences and things. But at least some of those employees, it's now like, oh, well, now I know that they've been vaccinated. I think the main thing to keep in mind there, though, is like, what are your responsibilities as the employer? And one of the best practices things to keep in mind with all of this data is privacy. Are we storing the records appropriately? Are they secured? Are they separate from the personnel files, as required by the ADA? But also, are we making sure that we don't disclose someone's status to another individual? So, it may be that Joe has their mask off and Jane has hers on. I, as the person reviewing, the vaccination records for the company in HR, like, I know that they each have, what their status is, but Jane and Joe are inferring one another's status, right? So keep in mind what your responsibilities are with regards to confidentiality of the records. So that's one thing, confidential records. That's an absolute huge best practice that you need. But also, like, how do you know what to do with those records and how to keep them confidential? That comes from policies. And so I think in this last year, more than any other year, we've really seen the case made for why you need strong policies in the workplace. Employee handbooks are not sitting on the shelf gathering dust anymore. They're not something that, somebody hands to you during your onboarding and you never see again. There's something that you're referring to constantly. And so getting policies in place, getting handbooks updated and, synthesized, especially if you started to expand your footprint, you've got new work sites, or you have employees who've relocated during the pandemic, so you're in new states, there's gonna be a lot of new things applicable to you. And also, you don't wanna have to make case-by-case decisions. This is really closely related. If you don't have a policy in place the first time somebody asks you about it, you're now in the situation of making a one-off decision that you then have to either apply to everybody, or you then are going to have to, switch lanes in the middle of, traffic and change something where it didn't apply to one person that way. And now you've created a potential liability and risk. So those are things you really have to keep in mind. And I actually thought it'd be really interesting to let William talk about this for a minute, because he came to us from a large nonprofit organization that had people coming in as part of its functions that was providing direct services. And so you kind of saw exactly how this was going on the ground during the pandemic.
Yeah, no, exactly. You get the nail on the head right there. Because, at this nonprofit, like was mentioned in the introduction, I was the chief legal counsel, but I was also the chief HR officer. And so this meant all these issues, all these questions of, whether we allow guests back into the home, what we do with employees. I was at the epicenter of this during this last year. We were pretty lucky. We only had Utah at the time that we had to deal with. And however, in Utah, we had 3 different locations, but each location was in separate counties, which meant for Utah at the time is they had county specific regulations that would change based off of infection rate and hospitalizations. And so we were having, as we're all aware, policies changing weekly. And so I was having to draft policies weekly, and then, but not only that, but also update them the following week. And so this created, a really hard environment to keep up to date, to keep everybody on the same page, and to be using these type of policies. To help create consistency, we decided rather than to go with an official policy update, getting approval, drafting and amending, policy handbooks, whatever they may look like, we decided to go with more of like an email update. I would send out weekly emails updating the teams and appropriate departments of what new policies and new directions were going to be. That worked for us, but as time progressed, I was noticing I was getting tons and tons of repeat questions. So 3 weeks ago, I'd send out an update, and then I would all of a sudden, in 2 weeks later, be getting the exact same questions. So our employees were not retaining and they were not reviewing these email policies. So right before I left, we had decided that we were going to start taking these email policies, incorporating them in a more formal manner, in a place, like the employee handbook, that we could, like Marie was saying, have more updated, that we can reference, that the hope was that wouldn't live on that shelf, that they could reference, so that way legal and HR can save some time and they're not fielding a lot of these questions and can focus on other things. And right before going, that was one of the reasons I reached out and was speaking with SixFifty to help with that employee handbook.
And then we stole you. But it's true though. I mean, I see that just with the employees that I supervise. I'll regularly get questions like, hey, how does this go? What am I supposed to be doing now? I know this changed, right? And you want to be able to diffuse the information across your organization so that no matter who they're asking, because they may not always ask the right person, or they may inundate the right person, no matter who they're asking, that person will be able to say, oh, we have a source for that. This is the answer, right? And we've seen it with the pandemic, but there's so many other things that it impacts, right? So now we've all started working remotely a lot more than we used to. So your video conferencing policies, what rules apply, your policies regarding, relocation. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. We see a lot of relocation happening now. All of these things, feed into those handbooks that we don't pay the kind of attention to that we need to, or now we're starting to for the first time. And I just wanted to sort of, talk about that for a second, because that's one of the big takeaways that every company has seen, no matter the industry. William was in nonprofit, I'm in tech, we're seeing the same issues. And another thing that I just wanted to say here is this is also really helpful with the health and welfare concerns that I think most employers have started to pay a lot more attention to during the last year. If you're clear in your messaging, employees know where they can find an answer. It reduces stress. The stress on the workforce over the last year plus has been really intense, and we're trying to find ways to mitigate it. This is a great way to do that for your workforce. So for me, that was one of the biggest takeaways. The more clear I was, the less my employees were worried. And I think that also goes for customers. If you have, customers coming into your venue and, you have the signs clearly posted, people aren't halfway up with their mask, what do I do? I don't know how to, or you have a website telling people when you get to our location, put your mask on, or if you're vaccinated, we're going to ask you for proof, or let people know what those policies are. Be clear and, concise, and make it something that is accessible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Marie. In fact, I frankly think there's never been a more important time to have a robust, accessible, readable employee handbook. Right? You need a handbook that your employees can look at and understand their expectations in a changing workplace environment. So this has, I think, been a really interesting discussion. I appreciate all the questions that we've gotten. I know that we're right at the top of the hour. I think there's just maybe one more question that I wanted to hit. Someone asked, does having a vaccination policy affect other vaccines if an employer mandates it? And I think if I understand this question, you might be saying if we require a COVID-19 vaccination, does that mean that we can also require maybe a flu vaccination, or that we are required to do that? I actually think that you need to look at those issues kind of separately, in that they are, the threat posed, I think, is a little bit different. And so I do think you could see, and I know there are some industries that require flu vaccines, and this is something that could become more common, but I don't think that you're bound just by what you do with regard to COVID-19. And then I think we had a question, and this may be from one of our customers, about whether we're going to create a self-certification of vaccine status that can be used in Santa Clara County. And yes, we are working on that. Our customer success team can help you set that up. If you're a SixFifty customer, or if you're interested, we can help you to collect and store that information through our team. So with that, I think we've hit all the questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us, especially those who have submitted questions. I think we've had a really interesting discussion. As we've said before, this is a dynamic area. It's changing. I actually would say on a daily basis, I'm seeing changes in different states and localities, and some of the changes are somewhat unexpected and interesting. And so I would just encourage all of you out there to stay abreast of what's going on. And if we can help you with that, we'd love to. If there are other services you found, you can use those. But I think it's important to know kind of what's happening as the law changes and as the guidance changes, and to think about how those changes affect your business. So we hope this has been helpful and that you'll join us in the future for other SixFifty webinars. And we again appreciate your attendance and hope you have a great day.